What is wrong with materialist metaphysics of today?
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe a few definitions. Materialism is the idea that you can reduce everything down to its lowest material constituents. So, in different epochs, the best candidate for that lowest layer of material reality has changed. But now people would probably say fundamental particles. If someone wants to be a materialist, um, it used to be a popular position, became popular through the centuries because of the successes of physical science, especially, and then engineering in the wake of physical science. The like the and then the peak success of materialism, it varied actually a little bit from country to country. In the English speaking world, we can say maybe like North America and the UK, the peak was probably a few decades ago. In continental Europe, so French and Germany, it was probably a few decades before. Um, mainly because the concrete failures of materialism, not just in its ontological description of as a philosophical position that tries to reduce everything, but also in terms of like its cultural repercussion of focusing just on materiality and material resources and engineering, that kind of stuff. It was so devastating, World Wars One and Two in Europe, that people abandoned materialism like earlier in um, in the continental Europe for cultural reasons that were more obvious. But like if you look at philosophers also after those wars in Europe, they also um, bash materialism, and it seems almost obvious to them that materialism is wrong philosophically, whereas people in the UK and America just kept on going with materialism for a long time because it worked out so well for them. World Wars One and Two were pretty good for America, and culturally, people just focusing on material wealth worked pretty well. So there was no need to sort of investigate the philosophical foundations of that. But eventually, there were too many intellectual issues that happened with materialism, and I think now we also see a lot of existential repercussions of materialism, the kind of nihilism that became more and more prevalent, the depression rates, and then following the nihilism, the depression that materialism yields. Because, like, naturally, like if you think that there's only fundamental particles moving following the laws of physics, then it's a pretty depressing worldview. Like we're just sets of particles following laws, and we might look like we're having emotions and goals and that kind of stuff, but fundamentally we're just like complex monkeys, complex robots shaped by evolution to propagate certain kinds of DNA sequences. So it's a very depressing worldview, and it makes people focus just on the material levels. Like you can't take goals and teleology seriously. You can't take humans even seriously. Like fundamentally, it's all genes or particles. So it's a very depressing worldview, and I think it's tied up directly with the fact that culturally people are looking for meaning these days. So, and there's many things more we can say, but broadly, like culturally, you can see there's a mini crisis happening that I think follows the wake of materialism. And also theoretically, there have been people bashing against materialism for actually there have always been good philosophers and theologians arguing against materialism, but people weren't really listening to them until the past few decades, where the case became like too strong against materialism, I would say. Maybe the first place where it became obvious that materialism was a failure was in philosophy of mind. Um, Maybe like the turning point is like the mid 1990s, where David Chalmers published his works on the art problem of consciousness, where people like finally had a good framework to explain that okay, there's something hard about consciousness that we cannot just reduce materialistically. There's lots of stuff we can maybe explain in terms of behavioral consciousness, like how we behave, what are like certain functions of consciousness. Maybe we can explain that in terms of like simpler functions that ultimately you reduce to the behaviors of particles. Like maybe you can do that, but at some point it became obvious that in terms of the qualities we experience, the qualia, as people will put it technically, cannot be reduced to particles. When I experience red or pain or anger, like those kinds of feelings, they're nowhere in the laws of physics. Like you won't find them at the lowest layers. Um, so that's in philosophy of mind. But then it sort of happened in other fields too. Cognitive science, which is fairly close to philosophy of mind, also had this kind of revolution with like people like Francisco Varela and the whole 4E cognitive science movement, which doesn't try to reduce everything down. They don't necessarily go straight away back to Plato and Aristotle and ancient metaphysics, but at least they will acknowledge that you cannot just reduce everything down to the lowest layer. Actually, if you want to produce intelligent systems or say interesting things about intelligent systems, it's a lot more fruitful to consider the higher level phenomena as actually happening. People started talking about emergence a lot then, and for example, if you want to create an intelligent robot, a robot that has some kind of intelligence, it's not a good strategy to try to just hard code those things like yourself in like low level software like people used to think with materialism. Now what people try to do is they set up the robots so that the robots will learn in conjunction with the environment, and they have like all of these complex trial and error kind of systems where progressively the robots can get better at stuff, and then a kind of understanding will emerge, kind of like they will talk about emergent abilities and that kind of stuff, where what emerges is not reducible to the lower layer. So that's just one example, but in cognitive science now, because of this kind of stuff, people don't try to reduce everything down to the lowest layer. They will take seriously higher phenomena. And
Mhm.
even now, like people are coming back to what some philosophers and theologians had been saying all along, or even some of the pivotal figures in physics itself, like I'm confusing the names. I think not Schrödinger, the Heisenberg. Like Heisenberg was pretty much an Aristotelian in terms of how he saw the quantum phenomena that he was able to uncover. Um, where if you look at what's going on actually in modern physics, in recent physics, the term modern could be confusing there because if you look at, let's say, Newton or physics up until the 20th century, materialism seemed reasonable because if you would just try to reduce everything down to atoms, little bits of matter, you actually made lots of progress. Things were looking pretty good. But early 20th century, when people discovered at the quantum level that there was like genuine probability happening there, then people like Heisenberg himself started to bring back the old idea of potential existing at the lowest layer of the physical universe, which is that for anything to be able to change, there has to be something like a layer of potential at the bottom of it. And if that's true, then what we should find as we go lower into the physical realm are entities that behave probabilistically, not just probabilistically because we don't understand like what's happening, or because if we just add more data then we would be able to like explain exactly what's going on, but actual probabilities. And that's a well acknowledged fact now in physics. There are still people who try to hang on to reductionistic and materialistic kind of interpretations of what happens at the quantum layer, but they're pretty rare because there are good theorems that show that there are like severe constraints on what can be predicted at that layer, like Bell inequalities for people who are interested and want to look into it. But basically, like it's extremely unlikely that what is happening at the lowest layer of physics is not getting. Yeah, I'm getting played by Zoom here, but um, now there's people bringing back old classical metaphysics to explain what's going on, even in modern physics, whereas it was physics in the
Mm.
first place, like in the 16th
Yeah.
and 17th centuries, that brought us materialism. So there's all of these
Y-
converging lines, culture that is going bankrupt with materialism, and also in different intellectual fields, philosophy, but also even science, that are pointing us away from materialism now.
Yeah, those are interesting things there, but like on that point there of even physics, you know, with materialism, you then the assumption is kind of that the smallest things are most real. So we keep zooming into matter and think, okay, now we'll find like the ground kind of layer.
Mhm.
But then if the bottom is potentiality and probability, then there's nothing that really you can kind of stand on. And it's something kind of when you think about it, it's a kind of odd assumption that only the smallest things are going to be most real. And we're talking to the cognitive scientist Anderson Todd, and it's like, just why things that are less material and less like physical real? I mean, you talk about the usefulness, right? I mean, it does make sense. Materialism is really useful because you could say that when you think of the world in that way, it's kind of easier to manipulate it and kind of systematize it. Um, but and you talk so that's it's funny that then on both on physics, but then you talked about cognitive science too. It's maybe I'm wrong to even say that materialism kind of is the dominant metaphysics at the moment, because um, science kind of increasingly finding it's not very helpful to think that there is like only one kind of causal layer right at the bottom. But I also would say there's definitely, as you say, there's still remnants, right? Because if you ask people, even people that are not philosophically minded or scientifically minded, and you probe their metaphysics that maybe they implicitly have, you'll kind of they'll actually like, oh, I do. They'll find that they actually did a kind of assume that, yeah, if you just keep zooming into matter, you'd find like that's kind of what they have in materialist metaphysics, even if they don't explicitly think about these kinds of things. And then, as you say, it does infiltrate culture, right? That's you kind of so that's one thing maybe even to get into. You kind of need a metaphysics, right? You can't just have no thought about what kind of thing the world is, right? And it's not something that science can tell you directly, but it's kind of assumptions, like, for example, from which science builds off of, from which culture builds off of, right? So is that something you can maybe touch on?
Mhm.
If materialism is wrong, why even should we care about these kinds of issues?
Mhm. Yeah, I think a big reason why people sort of can automatically become materialist is if you go through a scientific education, like at some point you'll see that materialism is wrong. When you get to more advanced physics, or if you get to study psychology or certain kinds of robotics, like you'll see that there are irreducible entities. But when you go through, let's say, the early stages of a scientific education, what you see is like you go through the physics and chemistry that people discovered like until like the 18th or 19th centuries, or maybe early 20th century, and for those centuries materialism looked like it was working. So I think that's why naturally people will sort of pick up that piece of science, and they will put a simple kind of materialism on top of it. They might not be aware that they're doing metaphysics, but I think naturally that was the like a very natural conclusion. When people started to be materialistic, let's say within science, like when Galileo said that the external world was materialistic, he wasn't trying to be a materialist. In fact, he wanted to say that the external world is describable mathematically, but like that's just the external world. Like when you get to humans, there are qualities that you cannot mathematize, and we're not reducible to matter, and that kind of stuff. So the when Galileo did this, he didn't expect that ultimately materialism would end up like eating the whole world, including humans. But that's sort of what happened, because for a few centuries, that way of thinking like bore lots of fruit in science and also in engineering. So that's one stream why I think people can naturally become materialist, because if you do a little bit of science but not a lot, that's sort of the implicit metaphysics you'll pick up. I think also another thing is that tied up with intellectual materialism, there's also cultural materialism, which is about like considering material acquisition as the most important things. And like those two have always like gone hand in hand and supported one another throughout the centuries. And at the moment, cultural materialism is still pretty strong. I think it's not as strong as it used to be. Maybe the its peak was probably, I don't know, the 90s or the early 2000s, where prosperity seemed like it was always gonna go up, and people weren't yet as depressed about the fact that, oh, like I'm realizing that wealth alone isn't gonna make me really happy. So I think because our culture still has not fully acknowledged, let's say, the failures of cultural materialism, um, then that's also why like people will pick up the, like, if the most important things around you are material, then when you think about the metaphysics, you'll tend to also think that the material things are the most important ones. So I think there are those two streams to answer your question.
Yeah, yeah. And it's kind of, even for me, so for example, intellectually, and we can get into it, and we will, about what kind of metaphysics, what kind of way of seeing the world might prove more effective than materialism. Uh, I guess living most of my life kind of thinking in materialist terms, it's I have to kind of stop myself and be like because even intuitively, I assume the world around me kind of is um, material, and but I like something I think about is, for example, people in the Middle Ages, or just any other cultures that didn't have a materialist viewpoint, and like how did they actually see the world, like trying to get through their perspective almost, did they see the world in terms of things like meaning and symbolism, or because as much as I can kind of intellectually grasp those things, to you kind of have to live in a certain world. And so, as you say, if our culture is still materialistic, and you know so I've kind of recently become a Christian, but there's also a way in which a church can become like it's like a segregated. Oh, that's that part of my life, and now I'm back into the materialist kind of world. So there's kind of still a way in which I'm like unsure exactly how one would have actually seen, and like what things would have been relevant. How would they have seen the world with not in a materialist sense.
Yeah, I think within like non-materialistic cultures, people have varied, like in the degree to which they would focus on the material layer of reality and to which they would focus more on forms, on abstract patterns. Um, and even within those cultures, I think there would be like people who are on different points of the spectrum, and I think that's probably healthy. That's probably a way for us to all like help one another and not go crazy in our own ways. Um, I think like if you go back to even maybe like one of the first examples of this is like the differences between Plato and Aristotle, at least how they've been played, like in the literature since then, where Plato focused more on the forms, on the ideas, and then saw um, that the material world is like a reflection, maybe even a kind of decayed version of the ideas. And like in that kind of world, I know people who live more like this. They focus a lot more on patterns, um, and a lot less on, let's say, how things concretely land and shape themselves, like bottom up. It has advantages and disadvantages. Like it's a very meaningful kind of worldview because you always look for the intelligible patterns behind things. A danger, though, is that you might think that there are patterns that aren't really there. So I've seen people go off the rails in terms of like turning coincidences into patterns, or turning more tragically like certain cultural patterns into conspiracy theories like too easily. So that's one thing that can happen if you focus more on like all the patterns around you, and you give like too much place in the on the patterns and not enough on the earth. But concretely, there are other people, like maybe like an example would be Aristotle was a bit more like this, but still, he was a philosopher. Like he wasn't just focused on the material side of things. But there would be very concrete people who don't do philosophy at all and who just care about how things work concretely. Like they're doing their own business. They're, I don't know, warriors or agriculturalists or whatever, and they're just doing like their own like thing on the earth. And they're a bit more skeptical of every time they think they see a pattern. So you see this like I think maybe most people even are like this because you're less likely to go, let's say, catastrophically wrong fast if you do that. Like you will not be as sure that you're noticing patterns and often that will save you from trouble. But you also won't necessarily go very high or make very big corrections that could often like be very useful.
Mm.
I think there's always been like people on different places on the spectrum, and I'd say that in our epoch today, we're definitely more on the materialistic kind of pragmatic types, where it's going to be harder to try to live in a world of like intelligible patterns all around you. We're not as used to this. At let's see, in contrast, I know that at the time of the beginnings of Christianity, most people culturally were very much Platonists. Like people, like the existence of God was like totally obvious to them, and then people saw that there were intelligible patterns ordering everything, and people were very focused on those, and it was easy to not take too seriously, let's say, the lowest layers of reality, and to jump maybe sometimes too quickly to theological interpretations of everything that was happening.
Mm.
Um, today it's the opposite, and if you, in the same way that it would be alienating for a person living in first century Palestine to be a materialist, it's often alienating for us today if we try to be more of a Platonist. If
Yeah.
we try to see patterns everywhere, because not that many people around us are going to be doing that, and it's not what our culture reinforces. So it's possible to do. Like Jonathan seems to be doing that pretty well. For instance, I know some people who can do that. Um, I'm personally a little bit more in the middle, where like I try to notice the patterns, but I'm much more skeptical of like whether what I'm seeing is an actual pattern or it's just a
Mm.
hypothesis that I have at the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting you say like for yourself then it's more notice it but not don't necessarily because I think so for me and you kind of mentioned like maybe the degree to which someone thinks more about higher level patterns versus more materially is maybe for example personality types and just it depends on the
Yeah.
person. And for me I feel like I'm someone who it does have more of a tendency to see bigger patterns, but then for me I kind of almost try and not ignore them but I kind of dismiss them because I think I have a tendency to like go with them, and so I try and assume that they're not there. But then sometimes I'm like, that seems Think about Carl Jung's synchronicity. Sometimes I'm like, that's
Hmm.
also a bit hard to ignore. But and I think one thing you said there about culturally, the thing is that if you take that position of seeing more patterns, you're kind of isolated because other people don't
Hmm.
think in that terms. And there's a way in which like there's not that many people you can go and talk to like, hey, I saw this, is this something you feel like that's correct to the world at the moment? It's because people will just go, what are you on about? No, I mean, why would that's not even like something you should think about,
Hmm.
so there's a kind of way in which if there were like ways of people you can go to, it was more in the cultural language, it might be a little easier, but
Yeah.
it's like something that you can't kind of understand, and then there's no kind of communities of intelligence to sort of interpret that for you and help you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think also people can correct you if you're going off the rails, because um, like if you live in a culture where lots of people are Platonists and lots of people see patterns around them, then you can have an idea of who's going crazy and who's not. Like if you think you see certain kinds of patterns, and you go talk to certain people, and you see that the people who have good lives don't believe in the patterns you believe in, and then the people who believe you are the crazy ones, then you should probably like check yourself. But if you live in a culture where there are very few people who notice patterns, then it's going to be harder for you to get self-corrected. And the same could happen like the other way around. Like if you try to do like materialistic kind of science, like in the Middle Ages, there would be very few people around you, and you might spend your whole life like on dead end hypotheses. So
Mm,
like it's um, it's a balance, trade offs.
yeah, yeah.
It's fine to break off from the mainstream of what your civilization is doing if like you have good reason to think that you're going to be right, um, but there's a risk associated with it.
Yeah, that makes me think about science today. And if you just there's so many papers out there, and you don't need to fear that if you're seeing a pattern and it's incorrect, because like if people someone thinks you're wrong, they're gonna attack
Yeah,
you. And that's kind
yeah,
of that can be an annoying thing if you're a scientist, but it's also a good thing because like it kind of checks you. Like if you were wrong,
yeah,
people are trying to find if you're wrong.
yeah,
Whereas like with other things, like no one cares about your like strange thing that happened in your life or your community, or hey, I see this thing going on in the world, like am I like, I know there's, I don't know what scientific theory to apply to what I'm seeing, but like I'm pretty sure something, this or that thing is going on. And and you can't really
yeah,
do anything about that. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah,
So we talked about then like kind of brought that in, like, so there's you kind of mentioned then that there's an alternative kind of, or the opposite extreme of materialism. Materialism is a kind of extreme. So what about like a kind of, you mentioned Neoplatonism or kind of ancient, what kind of what is a good mix, or what kind of metaphysics do you think like would be a more helpful replacement?
yeah. I think maybe to frame this, it's useful also to speak of like what a kind of just reaction could be, because if people notice the failures of materialism, it's easy to swing the other direction and become a kind of idealist. That's what happened in many ways in continental Europe after the world wars and the obvious failures of materialism, where people like became idealists or phenomenologists in ways that were like often idealists. You see that, okay, like we cannot reduce everything down to matter. A good example being the mind, that you cannot reduce down to matter. So we're going to try to see instead like things the exact opposite way. So rather than reducing everything down to matter, we're going to think that everything exists through consciousness. And this can have like just symmetrical intellectual problems. We probably don't want to do that. It's not exactly what the ancients were doing. Um, they were a little bit more, I would say, on the side of idealism than on the side of materialism. And I think Christianity is like straight the integration of both. If you look at the kinds of metaphysics that you have in Plato or even Aristotle, and similarly even in like Hindu metaphysics, like it's in the old world, most people saw the world existing top down mainly, where like just below God you have the realm of forms that are gonna like be the patterns that shape matter. And in most of those cosmologies, it would be really a bottom up thing, where what is below will be shaped by what is higher, but you don't have very much a sense that the bottom layer is good and has a kind of interesting role to play in all of this. So you will have like in, let's say, different Neoplatonist ontologies, you would have like God creating the news, the logos, like there would be like this whole chain of like top down layers until you get to the earth. um, in Christianity, though, and Judaism, it's very interesting because you have both movements. God creates the heavens, so the forms, and He creates the earth, the potential, and then He creates like everything in like an up and down motion until He gets to the middle where man is. So it's not a strictly top down or bottom up process; it's both. Um, it wasn't totally that in ancient metaphysics. Like they was close in some ways. Like even if I said that they do it mainly top down in their cosmologies, still they had the idea that there is something like pure potential at the bottom of things, and there are tons of layers that exist. So the potential that exists at the lowest layer for them would be shaped into the four elements, so fire, air, water, and so on. Today we'll say fundamental particles. The details don't matter too much. And then above those fundamental constituents, then you would have more complex things that appear, eventually making their way to like um, animals and humans and societies and like the planet and so on. So you kind of had the top down and bottom up system in the ancients, but it was much more top down. Whereas in Christianity, you have really the interpretation of both forms, shape, you can say patterns. And I haven't really defined what those are in this conversation, so it's good to take an example. I really like to take mathematical forms, especially to start, because it gets people to see clearly that forms are not spatio-temporal entities. If you take a mathematical theorem like the Pythagorean theorem, realize that this theorem would be true even if all humans disappeared tomorrow. The theorem would still be true. Even if the entire physical universe vanished, the Pythagorean theorem would still be true. It does describe and rule spatio-temporal patterns. That theorem is always going to be true in spatio-temporal in the spatio-temporal realm, but its truth is not dependent on the spatio-temporal realm. And it's the same thing for all patterns. And forms are not just abstract mathematical patterns; they're all patterns, really, including how, let's say, colors interact with each other, how narratives are patterned, like all of these things that are non-spatio-temporal but that describe spatio-temporal events and things are forms. And in classical metaphysics, and also in the Christian version of classical metaphysics, forms emanate top down, where forms are ideas in the mind of God. They're the logos, they're all of the truths that will shape the different layers of creation. And then bottom up, there is potential, there's the earth at the bottom, that's going to emerge into different entities that are shaped by certain forms. So you can then describe things bottom up or top down. And it's a kind of metaphysics that people are going back to, especially in cognitive science, but in general, in the different sciences that don't try to reduce things anymore to the lowest layer. You will have something like the idea that at the bottom layer of physics, we see there's potentiality. Then above that, we have fundamental particles. So what you have there is there's a form, the form of a certain particle. You can describe it in many ways mathematically. Like math doesn't exhaust what the form of an electron is, for instance, but still, it gives us a good idea of what the form of the electron is. Something abstract, non-spatial temporal that comes to rule, to inform, to shape potential, to create a specific entity. So it's a meeting of heaven and earth, a meeting of a pattern that exists outside of space and time, and matter, concrete potential that is formless, but that becomes formed into a concrete thing. And then if you take many fundamental particles, they can be potential, they can be matter for an atom, which is informed by a higher form, a higher pattern. Again, we can take an equation to have an idea of what the form of an atom is. It's not all that an atom is, but it gives us a good idea. And then same thing, up and up and up, where atoms can be molecules, or a higher kind of form lens. Molecules can assemble into cells, organisms, and so on. So this kind of metaphysics, you add it in the ancients, like in Plato or in Aristotle, you add this. I think it became perfected in Christianity, where the place of the bottom up in this equation was more recognized and seen as something good, which wasn't the case in classical metaphysics or in Oriental metaphysics either at the time. And people are coming back to it in the sciences too. This idea that you should not reduce everything down to the lowest layer or to the highest layer for the matter. By and large, you should see the world as existing in a hierarchy of patterns and potential that meet at different layers to produce different entities that are all genuinely existing.
You know, when you talk about the bottom up and then the top down kind of informing and kind of co-creating each other, do you think that would it be reasonable to say that the patterns, the higher forms, are they also changed by the lower potential? I mean, just for example, like in Plato and the kind of forms there, maybe something that's kind of it eternally exist. But like this is, for example, when we think about things like the process of evolution, and then like in a way, are new forms being created, that new patterns that not we wouldn't like they don't necessarily exist before they kind of emerge. I'm just because I assume the way you're talking about it is that patterns they shape potential, right? It's kind of the whole point. But does is it would I be right in saying it's like a mutual process?
Well, I would say that potential allows form to lend. So I wouldn't say that forms can change per se. Forms themselves exist outside of space and time. there are patterns that don't change. But um, if the lowest layer changes, it's possible for a form to be replaced by another. And it's also possible that within a higher form, smaller forms change and it doesn't change the highest one. So even just take yourself, like the form of Jack can be stable at this layer, and yet the forms of like your cells, how they're organized, is going to change like all the time throughout the day, and that's fine. So I wouldn't say that forms um, themselves change. I can say that like there can be a change from like things like matter will go from being shaped one way to being shaped another way, being shaped by one form to then being shaped by another form. This can be ruled by a higher form in all cases.
Yeah, interesting. So this might be a kind of difficult question. I don't know if it is something that you think about in your metaphysics, but like when you talk about God there and that be God mediating everything. I mean, I'm a Christian, so I accept that, but I'm just wondering how do you more specifically think about how God shapes creation? Like as in because is God a pattern? Is that or how it kind of seems outside of the whole process? So how are you thinking that God interacts with all of this?
Yeah, here there's a lot of interesting material for the ancients. You go back, let's say Plato and Aristotle, or like the entire most of Hellenic culture or Roman culture for that, like the whole like in classical antiquity, people didn't need to argue for the existence of God. For instance, it was pretty obvious. You can find certain arguments in Aristotle, let's say, but he wrote books about everything. By and large, people didn't feel like they needed to justify something like the existence of God. It was just obvious. If you have this hierarchy I mentioned earlier, then like you reach higher and higher forms. These forms exist somewhere, like they don't exist in space and time, they must exist elsewhere. And you can also show that they all interconnect, because truths will tend to imply one another, like the way that different mathematical theorems imply one another and they're all nested. So ultimately all truths are connected, all truths are one. So because of that, it's very natural to say that all these forms are the logos, they are God, they are the ground of intelligibility for everything. And the fact that forms and potential meet fruitfully at all those different layers makes it very like natural and obvious that there's a god behind all of this, and this god isn't like one engineer who has like abstractly decided all of those things, but he's like the simple ground of all of these different processes. He's the creator both of heaven, of all the patterns, and the earth, the potential that's going to be shaped by all of those patterns. um, So the way then that God will act through all of this creation, you can see it like even just philosophically. Like it wasn't surprising for the ancients, uh, even the pagans like Plato and Aristotle. Like in a way, God is always acting through everything because He's the first cause of all of those things. He's the patterns come from Him and the matter comes from Him. So of course, like in a way, everything is ultimately caused by God. He's always like acting through secondary causes, but He's always acting. So and there are many analogies there we can try to use, especially to understand that there can be like a kind of freedom in secondary causes, even if ultimately the first cause is always in control. So, simple example of primary and secondary causality. Let's say I'm using chalk to write on the board, then the chalk is a secondary cause in what's happening. Like I'm deciding what's going on the board, and that is a cause of what is happening. And the chalk, like hitting the board physically, is also a cause of what's happening, but it's secondary to my desire to write on the wall this or that thing. Um, if in that same example I'm moving my arm, I'm deciding to move my arm. That's the more primary cause there. And then all the different movements that my cells are going to make in my arm to support that decision, they're secondary causes. And there's lots of randomness that's going on there. There's like the chemical interactions that are going on in my arm when this is happening are very, very complex. There are lots of possible randomness. You could say freedom in the ways that the cells could do this, but overall they're constrained by my desire to go and raise my arm. So similarly, God is the original intention, the original pattern, the original idea behind all that's happening, even if there can be lots of randomness, lots of freedom in the secondary causes. So there's a way in which he's always acting. Um, and then you can also talk about, let's say, more direct involvements, like maybe God will go through those different layers of the hierarchy to cause something that's more special, to cause something that's out of the ordinary, let's say, out of the ordinary patterns that happen at a certain layer. Like this would be miracles, for instance. So there's more we can say. So maybe I
Yeah,
will
yeah,
just like stop and say like
yeah,
that's the basic response, and feel free to
yeah. I
respond or
was
ask more.
reading your writing on miracles and C.S. Lewis and him speaking about them. And so there's a couple of things I want to say there, but on miracles, I mean, it's interesting because, like, as you say, with like just thinking about something like cognition, this high level pattern, and like things like I move limbs, I move tissues, I move cells, I move, and then eventually, in a way, atoms, molecules are moving from this high level pattern. Um, but there's a way in which for like certain things, even higher level patterns are moving through even lower level things, right? And normally you don't need to invoke the highest level thing because there are like more parsimonious, reasonable explanations at lower levels of causality. But then something, miracles say, it's not. So I mean, why don't you try and like maybe talk about that because that is interesting. And there's a couple of things I want to though ask as well about the degree to which um, God ultimately has reign and causality and causes things, but there's like freedom for us in that. But yeah,
Yeah, well, I mean, for like for selecting the right degree of explanation, that's something we do often without noticing. But let's say if I ask you why you're talking to me today, it would be wrong for you to start to explain what's going on at the level of your cells. Like in a way it would be a true explanation. You could answer like there's all of these neuronal firings happening in my neurons. You could explain also, well, there's all of the, you could go even lower, like you could say there's all of these interactions happening between my fundamental particles. It follows this gigantic equation, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing today.
hmm.
But it would be a good explanation. Not only it's not practical, but also often it would be totally wrong to say that, because there could be another neuronal configuration that would still yield to you being there, like speaking with me today. There's actually, it's called the multiple realizability in the philosophical literature and in cognitive science. There's actually like a combinatorial explosion of brain states that can yield to the exact same eye level phenomenon. So it would be wrong to give like a specific neural configuration as an explanation for the eye level phenomena of you speaking with me today at the moment. So, and there are other places where we do this in science or in ordinary life. If we try to explain what's happening, let's say in fundamental physics, and we try to just like talk about potential, it wouldn't explain anything. Like we need to
Right.
invoke higher level laws, even if
Yeah.
they're weird laws that are probabilistic, to explain what's going on there.
We also like if you try and explain why am I talking to you now. I mean, we could say, oh, it's because I had this meeting on my calendar, and I mean, yeah, I guess you must have had like we had to have a call to do this on, but like that isn't really a good explanation for why I'm talking to you. And then you could say, well, I'm talking to you because this is God's will, which is yeah true, but it's also not that useful.
Yeah.
So on that scale too.
Yeah, so when it comes to miracles, we have to make a distinction at some point, because as I said earlier, technically God is the primary cause of everything. So that includes ordinary and extraordinary events. So where do we draw the line for miracles? Typically we would say something that is caused more directly by God than usual. So um, something that escapes the lowest layers of explanation. So let's say An example that can get us close to miracles: the placebo effect. The placebo effect is a kind of magic where two people, you, the patient and the doctor, will do a kind of ritual where the doctor gives something that materialistically has no causal power on the ill of the patient, but because of the ritual, the story, where there's like a doctor dressed a certain way in a certain setting, the patient has waited, has like taken an appointment and so on to go speak to the doctor, and then the doctor gives them something and tells them like take this pill every day for a week or whatever, and then through this ritual, the person is going to be healed, and that's not something you can reduce to material causality because like the placebo pill has no causal power at the material layer. It's also not about individual psychology because you cannot administer placebo to yourself. You need someone you believe in to do it for you. So it's like irreducibly happening at the level of two people in a story. So in that, you have a higher pattern that's explaining something that would be weird at the lower level. If you try to get like an explanation only at the material or psychological layer for what's happening there, you would miss on like the actual explanation. And now for a miracle, you would need something that requires the ultimate frame to explain what's happening. You would need the theological frame. You would need to invoke like the God that is behind forms and also behind potential to explain it. So there are like I think the best candidate is the incarnation for that story. So we can dive into it more if you want. But just to answer your question initially, that's how I would define a miracle. It's a place where God is required as the level of explanation of an event.
Yeah, let's get into something like the incarnation, just to understand as well how miracles are not necessarily like anomalies or against the nature of God or reality, but they kind of it helps actually you to understand it. But like first, one question on this causality and God versus the secondary causality.
Mhm.
When you think about stories like in the Bible, like Adam and Eve, for example, they sinned, and there are falls in the Bible. Um, but the thing is that these falls are part of the story, like they're important in a way. And I'm just wondering, like, did they have to happen? For example, could there be like, could we reality have been in a way that Adam like didn't sin, but like this could have been different. Um, but God would have still achieved the same ends, and even though he did sin, God is still going to achieve the same ends, but it's just going to look differently. Like it's a kind of, I don't know if I don't want to give you a trick question or something. I'm just thinking through this. Like do you think that's like something feasible to think about?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, all those questions are tricky because they happen at such a high level of abstraction that it's hard to be confident in what we're gonna say, and often there are no dogmas about this in tradition. So let's say, did the incarnation have to happen? That's an open question. There are people who argue for, people who argue against. Did Adam have to fall? That's also an open question. Could God have created the world in such a way that um, the fall wouldn't have happened, and yet the world would have been at least as good? That's also an open question. So many of these, like the tradition hasn't set as dogma, so we cannot achieve certainty on them. But um, to sort of gesture towards, I think, what you want to get out of those questions, um, I think there's definitely like probably God could have created the world a different way where different things happen, but because God is the ground of intelligibility, is the logos, the truth in which all in a way in which all things connect. Whatever God was going to create, if He was going to create, was going to be intelligible, coherent, was going to be interesting, was going to be beautiful ultimately, um, and like within all of those, like there are many different things humans could have done, presumably, um, but I'd say like the overarching constraint over this kind of interpretation is that whatever we imagine to have been possible must ultimately be coherent and beautiful.
Mhm. Okay.
So I'm not sure if that helps because I just said like there's lots of that we cannot answer, but what's important is that we have to realized that everything God was going to create was going to be beautiful ultimately.
That makes sense. Um, so the incarnation then as a miracle. Tell me about it, and as well, because one thing too we've sort of laid out in metaphysics, and I think it's related to the incarnation. Is that like at one point you had conversations with John Vervaeke about panpsychism, and that this is kind of a good view. But then you have some really fascinating arguments about why actually kind of something to the core of reality would be love instead, as a kind of this mediator between upper and lower
Mhm.
levels. And it's something I talked about with DC Schindler about how maybe consciousness, or at least self-consciousness, there's some way in which actually like it doesn't come about other than you need love for that.
Mhm.
And it's something I kind of intellectually was like, yeah, that makes sense. But then I was just thinking about it. You think about like people that are not, they like grew up with like, they're abandoned, they grow up with wolves or something. They're not, they don't become a person. There's something to do with like selfhood and the care that's given that actually like gives rise to like
Mhm.
the ability to like think of themselves as an agent. And so there's maybe some actual genuine way in which consciousness could arise out of love. It's kind of a thing to throw in there in the incarnation, maybe something to just kind of first, just because I think it's kind of a helpful way to fill out our metaphysics, like why the importance of that.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, the incarnation, to define it, is the doctrine that God, that is behind all forms and behind potential, will take human body. So we'll go through all of these layers, and that person that will take flesh in the middle of that hierarchy is the same person as the logos. So the instantiation of the logos, the the instantiation of the logos is the same as the instantiation of Jesus in the middle of the heaven and earth hierarchy. And like, if this is true, it would clearly be a miracle, because you are directly invoking the ground, like of creation in that very definition of the dogma. So um, why would that be a good dogma to hold? As for other explanations we mentioned earlier, it has to actually be explaining something. Like, it has to be a frame that explains things that couldn't be explained at the lower layers. And also, like, you have to explain things that you can explain for lower layers, but you also have to not make mistakes in your explanation. And that's how we judge theories in general, not just theological dogma, but also how we judge scientific theories. Let's say, um, when when Newton came up with his theory of gravitation, people thought he was crazy, because he was proposing an action happening at a distance of force, something not material. And at the time, everyone was a strict materialist, in the sense that a mechanist. That's the right word, not material. Like, Newton is still like a materialist in his physics, but I mean, not mechanical. People thought that everything had to be like mechanically, like, connected to one another to be able to move. And Newton said, scratch that. We'll talk about the force acting at a distance. And people thought he was insane to propose that, but ultimately his theory won out, because if you granted it, he would be able to explain things that you couldn't explain at the lowest layer of just mechanical forces. Um, so similarly, to judge whether the incarnation is a miracle that happened or not, I think we have to start with it as a hypothesis, like we did for Newton, and say, okay, if it were true, what could it explain? Would it make reality more intelligible or less intelligible? And because we're talking about the highest frame of reality in that story, then what we have to be able to explain better is like everything in creation, because it's the highest layer. Like, we have to explain things that couldn't be explained if you look only within creation. So ultimately, that means that the doctrine will apply to everything. Like, it should make everything clearer ultimately, but it would be an infinitely long argument. We can't talk about everything. So there's a few strong points that we can mention. I list many of them in my the articles I wrote and the discussions I had on miracles. The one I like the most personally is that it explains the composite nature of man, the fact that we are both rational and material, which would be very weird otherwise. Um, something that the ancients found marvelous, but that had no proper explanation, I think, until the Incarnation, which is there's a very strange bridge happening in humans. As I said earlier, we can discuss abstract ideas like the Pythagorean theorem that are not spatiotemporal. Like, we can discuss truths that are outside of space and time, and yet somehow there's a bridge that happens within humans where we can take those abstract ideas and have them impact the world. We can make bridges or like other technology using mathematical abstractions. So somehow there's a bridge that happens between like those eternal truths existing outside of space and time that happens within man. And conversely, like we can like draw on a board and people will understand through the signals that get to their eyes that all of this material stuff refers to abstract theorems that exist outside of space and time. And we do this kind of mediation all the time. We're always mediating between abstract forms that exist outside of space and time, and vice versa. Like it's always bottom up and top down happening. And it's incredible that it happens like all the time in humans, like all over the planet. And this multiplicity of phenomena that looks strange if you stay at this level is suddenly explained if you consider the doctrine of the Incarnation, where all of these layers are crossed by God Himself and comes to unite Himself to all of those layers. You can see that there's a coherence to the world where God created all of those layers that interpenetrate from abstract forms to concrete matter. They would all meet harmoniously because God Himself will come and inhabit them harmoniously. So that's one way. There are other arguments, and we could definitely go on forever. Like I think you can see in a way that Jonathan's channel is doing this. He's always trying to use the pattern of the Incarnation to explain something in creation. Um, so I just mentioned one that I think is like my favorite as someone who is very influenced by classical metaphysics. The idea that I can explain this weird fact about the composite nature of man, this weird hierarchy that happens in creation in general by the Incarnation, makes the whole thing much more elegant to me. I can suddenly explain something that I couldn't explain otherwise.
Right, and I kind of just want to chime in with one of the things that I found I liked most about how you kind of write that the Incarnation actually helps make the world more intelligible is, for example, the death of Christ actually it kind of subverts death. Like, it uses the fact that he dies to like bind everyone together in the fact that they all crucified him, whether they're on his side or not. And whereas in the past, like whether it's Cain and Abel, or like you just see there's a pattern of like even the founding of Rome, Romulus and
Mhm.
Remus, like there's people they do something wrong and then they bind over, like they blame a scapegoat, right? I think it's Gerard. He,
Yeah.
these kinds of theories. So then you think, because then you can think, why does death exist? Why do these kinds of things exist? And then you go, oh, actually, there's a way in which death became a good thing because it actually like leads to eternal life, and that was only possible through Christ. So does that make sense as well? Am I recapitulating your arguments
Yeah, yeah, it
in a
is
sane way?
definitely one part of it. Like otherwise, death would be weird. And there's even something that the ancients noticed. I think it was Aristotle. I don't know if Plato said it too, but Aristotle said that humans are very strange in the fact that we seem to be the only thing in the universe that doesn't achieve its purpose. Like if you look at animals, they will typically reach the goals they're going for, like growing up and like reproducing and feeding and that kind of stuff. Like some of them will die, but by and large, like it works. Like they seem to reach their purpose and they're happy in the sense that they fulfill their purpose. Or material things. Like today we would say things slightly differently, but let's say for Aristotle, the way that things move physically is also because they're moving towards their purpose. So let's say the purpose of a rock when it falls is to reach the ground, and it does. Like it's working. Like the rock is happy. It's fulfilling its purpose. And today we would say things slightly differently, but it's still the same idea. Where like if let's say protons and electrons are attracted to one another because it's their purpose, like they like they're intelligibly going towards something, and then they become stable, so they're happy, like they achieve their purpose. But humans, like our purpose is to to be like to be happy, like to flourish, to become images of God. And most people don't achieve this. Like for the ancients, like they noticed this and they found it strange. Like there's this all harmony going on within creation, where everything seems to be achieving its purpose except for human beings. And it's tied up with death, as you mentioned, with, or we could say with sin in general. And the idea that this isn't how things were meant to be, like this isn't how things were in the garden, but then we were free and God allowed sin and death to enter into the world. But ultimately, he allowed this because he could make something greater out of it. So that's an explanation for what the ancients couldn't explain. Like for the ancients, it was mysterious that we don't achieve our ends. But with the story of Christianity, you found finally have the answer. And even within Judaism, like without the incarnation, crucifixion, resurrection, you don't really have a resolution either. Like you go down from the fall, and you have an idea that ultimately the Messiah will come and restore things, but it's not clear how it's really going to work. It was especially not clear that death itself would be used to fix the problem, and that in a way, like sin itself would be turned against itself because of our sins we crucified the logos, but he used that to make something greater out of it. So he really like used all of the tragedy that happened in the fall to make something greater, as you said.
Mm. Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a good ending point. So, do you have any last thing to say, or else where can people find your work?
No, nothing to add on this. I'd say at the moment, these days, I'm mainly working in French locally. I'm trying to test my ideas locally on the earth. I spend lots of time in the Evans the last few years doing abstract philosophy and theology, but now I'm trying to test and see how well I actually understand the ideas. Do I understand them well enough to bear fruit concretely in my community, in my family, at work, and so on? Because as I said earlier, technically the incarnation should make everything more intelligible. So if you understand it right, you should bear fruit like everywhere, literally in your life. So that's what I'm trying to validate in my life. But still, I'm producing content mainly in French, just because I live in a French city. So it's more likely that people around me will like be influenced by what I do if I do it in French. So you can look at my YouTube channel or my Twitter. I link to what I do in French. I have a French podcast with Jonathan. I also collaborate with a French media company here in my city. And otherwise, yeah, if I do English podcasts like this from time to time that you can follow on my Twitter. And I have a book that's gonna come up in the next few months with the Symbolic World Press. I also have a course that I did with Jonathan on the Symbolic World Circle community, where I go into symbolic world metaphysics very in depth, including some things that I won't talk about in the book. The book I want to be more sort of large public. I want everyone who's interested in escaping the meaning crisis to be able to understand the book, and I don't necessarily want to add extra advanced material that isn't necessary to escape the meaning crisis in that book. So I go into that more into the course for the real nerds out there.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack.